When the first light of June 6, 1944 broke over the English Channel, the German soldiers defending the Normandy coast knew something massive was about to happen. They could see it coming. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, an invasion fleet that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. And among those defenders, positioned in concrete bunkers overlooking the beaches, were machine gunners, men armed with the MG42, a weapon that would define that morning and haunt both sides for the rest of their lives. The story of D-Day is usually told from the perspective of the men hitting the beaches. We hear about their courage, their sacrifice, their slow advance through machine gun fire that seemed endless. But there's another side to that story, a side that rarely gets told. The story of what happened to the men pulling the trigger on those machine guns. And more importantly, what happened to them after they surrendered. This is a story about war's complexity, about the choices men make in moments of desperation, and about how history is written by the survivors. It's about moments that change the course of human history but were never officially documented. It's about the men who killed thousands but then spent the rest of their lives trying to find peace with what they'd done. To understand this story, we need to go back to 1942 when the MG42 first appeared in German service. It wasn't a revolutionary design. In many ways, it was simpler than previous machine guns. But simplicity was its genius. It was easier to produce. It was more reliable. And most importantly, it had a rate of fire that shocked everyone who encountered it. The MG42 fired between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute. Not the highest rate of fire in the world, but when you combined that with its reliability and its operator's skill, it became something terrifying. The weapon had nicknames that reflected how people feared it. The Hitler buzzsaw, Hitler's saw, the Hitler lawnmower. These nicknames weren't given in admiration. They were given in horror, because the MG42's effect on a battlefield was exactly like those nicknames suggested. It mowed down men. It cut through them. It created kill zones that seemed impossible to cross. When the MG42 appeared in North Africa, soldiers were shocked. When it appeared on the Eastern Front, they were horrified. By the time World War II was in its final years, the MG42 was the weapon that defined how soldiers died. It was the sound of death, that distinctive rattle, that tearing canvas sound, the chainsaw cutting through wood. Soldiers who heard it never forgot it. The weapon was so effective that it became standard across the entire German army. Every infantry platoon had one. Every defensive position had several. By 1944, when the Allies began planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, they knew they would have to deal with MG42 fire. They knew it would be their single biggest threat on the beaches, and they prepared accordingly. German commanders understood something fundamental about how to defend a beach. They understood that the best time to stop an invasion is before the enemy even reaches the shore. Or if he does reach the shore, stop him right there in the water and on the sand before he can establish a foothold inland. So the Germans built a defensive line called the Atlantic Wall. It stretched along the coast from the Dutch border all the way to Spain. It consisted of concrete bunkers, trenches, barbed wire, mines, and anti-tank guns. But the backbone of the defense, the weapon that would do most of the killing, was the machine gun along Omaha Beach, which would become the bloodiest beach of D-Day. The Germans constructed 15 major defensive positions called Widerstandsnester. In English, that translates to resistance nests. These weren't simple foxholes. They were fortified bunkers with multiple firing positions, overlapping fields of fire, and coordination between different nests that meant no matter where an attacker came from, he would run into machine gun fire. Each resistance nest was manned by anywhere from 20 to 50 men, armed with MG42 machine guns, 50mm anti-tank guns, mortars, and rifles. The positions were placed so that each could provide covering fire for the others. If an Allied assault team neutralized one position, they would immediately run into fire from an adjacent position. It was a system designed to maximize casualties and make each position defensible. The Germans had done their job well. They had studied amphibious operations. They understood the principles of defense. and they believed that the beaches of Normandy would be the cemetery of the Allied invasion. What the Germans didn't fully account for was American and British determination, innovation, and the sheer scale of the forces being brought to bear against them. The Allies had more men, more guns, more air support, and more resources than the Germans could match. But all that meant nothing if the men hitting the beaches were cut down before they could advance. One specific resistance nest became the most famous of them all. It was designated WN62, which stood for Whiterstands Nest 62. It was located at Colville-sur-Mer, on a bluff overlooking easy red and fox green sectors of Omaha Beach. It was about 450 meters from the shoreline, and it was manned by approximately 40 men, most of them from the 716th and 352nd German Infantry Divisions. In that position, in a concrete bunker with an MG42 machine gun, was a 20-year-old German soldier named Heinrich Severloh. He would become known as the Beast of Omaha. He would fire nearly 13,500 rounds that day, and he would later claim that he killed between 1,000 and 2,000 Allied soldiers. Historians dispute those casualty numbers. The total number of American casualties on Omaha Beach that day was about 2,400 across the entire beachhead. It's unlikely that one gunner, even with an MG42, killed even a significant fraction of that total. But what Severloh did accomplish was clear. He, along with other German gunners, created a killing field that made Omaha Beach the bloodiest of all the D-Day landing zones. The morning of June 6th began in darkness. The naval bombardment that preceded the landing started before dawn. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened up with their main guns. Thousands of shells rained down on the German positions. The noise was deafening. The explosions were catastrophic. For anyone inside those bunkers, it seemed like the entire world was ending. But the German Engineer Corps had done their job well. The reinforced concrete bunkers, with walls several meters thick, survived the bombardment. Many positions received direct hits and continued operating. The Americans would later confirm that much of the bombardment had little effect on the actual fighting positions. The guns were silent during the bombardment, but they would be firing again soon. As dawn broke and the bombardment shifted to different targets, the German soldiers in their bunkers took a look outside. What they saw was almost unbelievable. The sea was filled with landing craft, thousands of them, stretching from horizon to horizon. Small boats, medium boats, large transport ships, all of them heading toward the beach. The German soldiers knew what that meant. The invasion was here. This was what they had been preparing for, what they had been expecting, what they had been training to stop. But there was a problem, at least for the Germans. The Americans had originally planned to send tanks to support the infantry on Omaha Beach, but not just regular tanks. They had developed a special type of tank called the duplex drive tank, or DD tank. These were medium tanks with flotation screens that would allow them to land from the sea and provide armor support to the infantry. The theory was good. The practice was catastrophic. Out of 32 DD tanks launched in the first wave, 27 sank. Only 5 made it to the beach. Of those 5, only 3 were still able to fight. Most of the American infantry assault would have to proceed without tank support, facing machine gun fire, with almost no armor support at all. The British and Canadians had a better solution. They had special tanks called Hobart's Funnies, which included amphibious tanks but also specialized engineering vehicles designed specifically to deal with beach obstacles and fortifications. These vehicles would prove invaluable in the British and Canadian sectors. But the Americans didn't have them. The Americans had carefully prepared assault teams, training for trench clearing and bunker assault, but they would have to do most of it under machine gun fire with no armor support. When the first landing craft ramps dropped, what happened was terrifying. The men inside those boats were mostly fresh from training, many of them on their first combat operation. When they stepped out into the shallow water or onto the sand, they immediately came under fire from multiple positions. The machine gun fire was devastating. It wasn't just single shots. It was continuous, sweeping fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the bluffs, from the buildings behind the beach, from fortified positions that the bombardment hadn't destroyed. At Dog Green Sector, an entire company of the 116th Infantry Regiment came ashore. The unit took nearly 90% casualties within the first few minutes. 90%. That means 9 out of every 10 soldiers in that unit were killed or wounded almost immediately upon hitting the beach. The survivors, those few men who weren't hit in that initial burst of fire, had to make a choice. Move forward or die where they lay. Many men were pinned down right at the waterline. They couldn't advance because of the machine gun fire. They couldn't retreat because the boats were gone and the water was full of men trying to get to shore. They were trapped, and the machine gun fire was shredding their positions. Army medic Ray Lambert was on that beach that morning. He would later recall the sight of wounded men screaming in the water, of rounds slicing through the water and hitting soldiers who were already struggling in the surf, of men bleeding out in the shallows because they couldn't reach deeper water or the shore without crossing open ground swept by machine gun fire. The situation seemed hopeless. But it wasn't hopeless. Not yet. Because the Americans had trained assault teams whose job was specifically to silence those machine gun positions. These were men from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, men from Ranger units, men from engineer companies. They were trained to fight in bunkers, to use explosives, to flank and clear positions, and more importantly, they were armed with weapons specifically designed to deal with bunkers: bazookas, grenades, satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes. And once they could get close enough, flamethrowers, the tactic was simple. Small groups of men would use what little cover existed on the beach to work their way toward a machine gun position. They would come at it from a direction the gunners couldn't easily reach with their guns. They would throw grenades. They would use satchel charges to blow holes in the concrete. And then they would assault inside and kill whatever was left. It wasn't a neat tactic. It wasn't a textbook solution. It was bloody and desperate and required men to rush bunkers while under fire, knowing that they might die at any second. But it worked. One sergeant gathered a small team with a bazooka and moved on WN-61. They destroyed the 50mm anti-tank gun first, which was supporting the machine guns. Then they worked their way up to the bunker, engaging the gunners directly. When they finally reached the bunker itself, they had killed 7 defenders and knocked out 2 machine gun positions. They lost 1 man and had 1 wounded. For the number of casualties they inflicted, the cost was remarkable. This happened again and again across the beach. Small groups of soldiers using bravery and determination in whatever cover they could find worked their way toward German bunkers. At Dog White, Rangers stormed a strong point under smoke and silenced its guns. On Easy Red, engineers cleared obstacles and then climbed the bluffs to outflank German positions that had been keeping the entire beach pinned down. But reaching a machine gun bunker was only half the job. The real fight happened in the seconds after. When the assault team finally got close enough to a bunker, they had to clear it. And clearing a bunker where German soldiers were still willing to fight was a violent, brutal affair. Grenades would be thrown through firing ports. Satchel charges would be placed against the bunker walls and detonated. If the position was heavily reinforced, flamethrowers would be brought up and used to burn the bunker from the outside, forcing the occupants to either stay inside and die or come out and be shot. This wasn't war, as it's often depicted. It wasn't men standing and fighting each other at a distance. It was close-quarters combat where men were trying to kill each other with grenades and flamethrowers in spaces barely large enough to move around in. For the German gunners, this final assault was the nightmare they had feared. Once the Allies broke through the outer defenses and got close to the bunker, the fortification that had protected them became a prison. The narrow firing ports that had protected them from frontal fire also prevented them from seeing the attackers coming from the flank or rear. The heavy concrete walls that had kept them safe from bombardment now kept them trapped. When a German soldier in a bunker heard the boots on the ground above him, when he heard the muffled explosions outside, when he realized that the assault team had reached his position, he had very limited options. He could hold his position and hope the attackers would be repelled. He could surrender and hope he would be taken prisoner. Or he could try to make a break for it and attempt to escape to another position. Most German soldiers chose to surrender or fight to the death, By early afternoon, many positions had fallen. The assault teams had fought through, casualties mounted on both sides, but the beachhead was expanding. The resistance nests were being taken one by one or abandoned when they could no longer hold out. For the German machine gunners, the knowledge that they were priority targets added to the terror of those final moments. They knew that their guns made them responsible for enormous Allied casualties. They knew that the men attacking them had probably watched friends die to their fire. They knew that when it came time to surrender, they couldn't be sure they would be accepted. By the time the afternoon was well advanced, WN-62 was collapsing. The position was being attacked from multiple directions. Ammunition was running low. The gun was damaged. Casualties had been mounting throughout the day. Heinrich Severloh, the 20-year-old gunner, made a decision. He grabbed his rifle and ran. The retreat from WN-62 was a scramble for survival. Severloh and the other survivors made their way through shell craters and hedges, trying to avoid the American assault teams that were now all over the position. Some of them made it. Some of them didn't. By nightfall, the position had fallen. The next morning, June 7th, Severloh was surrounded by American troops. The position was lost. There was nowhere left to fight from. Surrender was the only option. Severloh gave himself up to American soldiers. But he was careful not to reveal that he had been one of the machine gunners. He didn't mention how many rounds he had fired. He didn't mention his role in the defense of WN-62. Why did he do this? Because Severloh knew what German machine gunners faced when captured. He knew that men who had just lost friends to machine gun fire might not follow the rules of war. He knew that there was a real possibility that instead of being taken prisoner under the Geneva Convention, he might be shot on the spot as a reprisal for the men he had killed, and Severloh's fear was not unfounded. There are accounts from D-Day of captured German soldiers, particularly machine gunners, being executed after surrender. These incidents were not officially documented. They were not reported to higher command. They were individual acts by men in the heat of combat, who had just lost their friends and had no patience for the legal niceties of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required soldiers to treat captured enemies humanely. It required that prisoners be protected from violence and summary execution, and the majority of American soldiers followed these rules. But there were exceptions. Under the stress of combat, with adrenaline pumping and the rage of having watched friends die, some soldiers did not accept surrender. How often did this happen? We don't know. The incidents were rarely documented in official records. There was no systematic tracking of reprisals. But there is enough anecdotal evidence in memoirs and veteran accounts to know that it happened. That machine gunners, in particular, were at risk of being executed instead of being taken prisoner. This was a dark reality of D-Day that wasn't often discussed in official histories or memoirs that were published in the immediate post-war years. But as more time passed and more veterans felt comfortable speaking about their experiences, it became clear that isolated instances of reprisal did occur. Severloh was fortunate. The soldiers who captured him did not execute him. He was taken prisoner and processed through the prisoner of war system. Like many German POWs, he spent time in American captivity and later in German captivity after Germany's surrender. But the experience left an impact that would last for decades. Severloh survived the war. He returned to Germany. He tried to rebuild his life in a country that was destroyed and occupied by foreign armies. But the memories of Omaha Beach never left him. For years, Severloh said very little about his experiences on D-Day. In fact, he kept quiet about his role in the machine gun position for decades. The trauma was too fresh. The guilt was too heavy. The psychological weight of knowing how many men he had killed, even in the act of defending his position as a soldier, was something he couldn't bring himself to discuss. But, eventually, as time passed and Severloh grew older, he began to process what he had experienced. He began to understand that his actions on D-Day, while they had killed many men, were not something he had chosen out of hatred or malice. He was a soldier. He was following orders. He was defending a position. The fact that his defense had resulted in tremendous casualties was the nature of war, not a personal moral failing. So Severloh did something remarkable. He reached out to the American veteran who had been wounded by his fire, a man named David Silva. Severlo had wounded Silva on D-Day. Now, decades later, with the war long over, the two men contacted each other. They met, and they talked. What happened in that meeting was extraordinary. Two men who had been trying to kill each other on D-Day sat down together and talked about their experiences. Silva had survived his wound and lived a full life. Severlo had survived and built a life in post-war Germany. And now they met as old men, separated by age and time from the young soldiers they had been in 1944. They shared stories. They talked about what D-Day had meant to them. Silva told Severlo about the wound, about the recovery, about the years that followed. Severlo talked about the trauma of being a machine gunner, about the faces of the men he had killed, about the psychological weight of that experience. And in that conversation, two men who had been enemies found a kind of peace. Not forgiveness exactly. Not reconciliation in a formal sense. But a human connection between two people who had shared an extraordinary experience and had lived long enough to process what that experience meant. Severlo's story is remarkable, but it's also not unique. Many German machine gunners who survived D-Day and the war came home with similar burdens. They carried memories that never left them. They struggled with guilt and trauma in a way that wasn't well understood or discussed in the immediate post-war years. Many of them spoke very little about their experiences. They would talk to fellow soldiers, to men who understood what they had experienced. But they rarely spoke to civilians or to people who hadn't experienced combat. The weight of what they had done, the knowledge of the men they had killed, was something that seemed impossible to explain to someone who hadn't been there. But as time passed and as more and more people became interested in the history of D-Day, some of these men felt compelled to tell their stories. Not to defend what they had done, not to excuse the casualties they had caused, but to document what they had experienced. To ensure that history would have an accurate account of what it had been like to be on the other side of the machine gun on that morning. The role of the machine gunner in D-Day was absolutely critical. The German defenders understood this. The gun positions were the backbone of the defense. The machine gunners were the most important soldiers in the resistance nests. Everything else was in support of the machine guns. The anti-tank guns protected the machine gunners from tank assault. The mortars and artillery supported the machine gun positions. The riflemen provided security and additional firepower. But the killing power, the ability to create casualties at a rate that would overwhelm the attackers, came from the machine guns, specifically from the MG42, and that killing power was well understood by the Americans who were attacking. The assault teams that moved on the bunkers knew that they were moving on the most dangerous positions. They knew that the men operating those guns would be putting out fire at a rate that was almost impossible to comprehend. They knew that each position they cleared would cost them casualties, but they also knew that if they didn't clear those positions, the entire beachhead would fail. The invasion would be stopped on the beach. The opportunity to liberate Europe would be lost. The war would continue for who knows how long. The stakes were that high, so men charged bunkers. Men threw grenades at firing ports. Men used flamethrowers on concrete fortifications. Men died trying to clear machine gun positions. And some of them, when they finally reached the Germans inside those bunkers and had the Germans at their mercy with grenades and guns ready to fire, made a choice about whether to accept surrender or execute the gunners. The records don't tell us exactly how many gunners were executed rather than taken prisoner. The incidents were not systematically documented. They didn't appear in official reports or after-action summaries. They appeared only in personal memoirs and in conversations between veterans long after the war. But enough accounts exist to know that it happened. That German soldiers, particularly machine gunners who were responsible for heavy casualties, were sometimes killed after surrender rather than being accepted as prisoners of war. Was this a war crime? By the standards of the Geneva Convention, absolutely. Was it prosecuted? In most cases, no. These incidents were individual acts by individual soldiers who were not court-martialed or punished for what they did. Was it understandable given the circumstances? By the standards of military law, no. But by the standards of human psychology and the immediate aftermath of combat, Perhaps it was understandable, if not justified. Men who had just watched their friends die to machine gun fire, who had just lost comrades to fire coming from a specific position, who were in the heat of combat and in the grip of adrenaline and rage and grief, sometimes made decisions that they would have made differently in calmer moments. This is not to excuse the reprisals. It is to explain why they happened, to acknowledge a dark reality of warfare that is often glossed over in the official histories, to recognize that soldiers, even soldiers fighting for a just cause, can commit acts that violate the rules of war when they are under extreme stress and trauma. For the German machine gunners who surrendered on D-Day, the uncertainty about what would happen to them must have been terrifying. They had to decide whether to accept capture and hope they would be treated as prisoners of war, or whether they would face summary execution as reprisal for the men they had killed. Most of them chose to surrender. Most of them lived. But the knowledge that some gunners did not live, that some surrendered and were killed anyway, must have weighed on the survivors. Severlo survived. He was processed as a prisoner of war. He spent time in captivity. He was eventually released. He returned to Germany and tried to rebuild his life. But the experience left scars that never fully healed. In his later years, Severlo wrote a memoir about his experience on D-Day. He spoke in interviews about what it had been like to be a machine gunner, about the horror of that morning, about the guilt he carried for the men he had killed, and he reached out to the men who had fought against him, to the Americans who had been on the other side of the line, to try to establish some kind of understanding and closure. His story is a reminder of the human cost of warfare, not just in terms of the casualties, not just in terms of the men who died on D-Day, but in terms of the psychological and emotional weight that the survivors carried for the rest of their lives. The machine gunners of D-Day were professionals. They were trained soldiers who understood their role and performed their duties as soldiers. But the fact that they were professionals didn't change the fundamental reality of what they had experienced. The killing, the chaos, the horror of that morning, the knowledge that their actions had resulted in the deaths of thousands of men. And for those who survived the fighting, there was another horror waiting. The realization that they might be executed not as combatants, not as soldiers in a fair fight, but as prisoners who had surrendered and were supposedly protected by the Geneva Convention. This reality, the fact that surrender didn't guarantee survival, must have influenced the final moments of some gunners. Some of them probably fought to the death rather than risk capture. Others probably surrendered and lived. Some probably surrendered and died anyway. The records don't tell us the precise numbers, but they tell us enough to know that this happened. That machine gunners on D-Day faced a unique kind of threat, not just from the assault teams attacking their positions, but from the possibility of reprisal once they were captured. And that is a historical reality that deserves to be acknowledged. Not to excuse it, but to understand it. To recognize that warfare, even warfare fought for a just cause, can result in violations of the rules of war. That soldiers, even soldiers from a nation that was defending itself from invasion, can commit acts that are technically war crimes. This is the dark side of D-Day. The side that is often not discussed in the popular histories and the movies. The side that makes D-Day not a simple story of good versus evil, but a more complex story of men under extraordinary stress making extraordinary choices. Heinrich Severlo lived until 2006. He wrote his memoir. He gave interviews. He met with David Silva and other Americans to talk about their experiences. And he spent decades processing the reality of what he had done on D-Day. His life after the war was not easy. He suffered from nightmares. He struggled with guilt. He had difficulty explaining to people who hadn't experienced combat what it had been like to be a machine gunner, what it had meant to fire nearly 13,500 rounds at men on a beach, what it felt like to live through the assault on his position knowing that every moment might be his last. But he survived. He lived a long life. He built a family. He contributed to the historical record. And in his final years, he tried to make peace with his past by meeting with the men he had fought against. That effort, that reaching out across the gulf of decades and warfare to try to establish human connection with former enemies, That effort is perhaps the most important part of Severlow's story, because it suggests that even in the aftermath of such terrible violence, there is a possibility for understanding, if not forgiveness. Other German machine gunners from D-Day lived similar lives. Some of them survived the war and came home to a Germany that was devastated and occupied. Some of them were captured after D-Day and spent years in prisoner-of-war camps. Some of them died in the fighting after D-Day, defending other positions as the Allies advanced inland. But those who survived carried the memories of that morning with them for the rest of their lives. The memory of the endless waves of men coming off the landing craft. The memory of the noise of the MG42, that distinctive rattle that became the sound of death. The memory of watching the positions fall around them, one by one. The memory of the moment they realized they couldn't win, that the position was going to be overrun, that their only choice was to fight to the death or surrender and hope. And for many of them, the memory of realizing that even surrender wasn't a guarantee of survival. This is the untold story of D-Day, the story of what happened to the men behind the machine guns, the story of how the rules of war broke down in the heat of combat, the story of men who committed acts that violated the Geneva Convention and were never punished, the story of survivors who carried trauma for decades and finally, late in their lives, attempted to reconcile with their former enemies. It's a story that reminds us that history is more complex than the simple narratives we often tell. That warfare creates situations where even men from just causes can commit unjust acts. That the men on both sides of that conflict were human beings dealing with trauma and terror and the knowledge that they were probably going to die. And it's a story that, once we understand it, changes how we think about D-Day. Not to diminish the courage of the men who assaulted those bunkers. Not to excuse the violence of the German defense, but to acknowledge the full complexity of that terrible morning. The machine gunners of D-Day were soldiers. They were professionals who understood their role and performed their duties. But they were also human beings who carried the weight of that experience for the rest of their lives. And their story deserves to be told, fully and honestly, not as a justification for their actions, but as an acknowledgement of the human cost of warfare. When we talk about D-Day, we often talk about the victory, the successful invasion, the beginning of the liberation of Europe. And those things are true. D-Day was a turning point. It was a necessary operation to defeat Nazi Germany. It was worth the cost, even the terrible cost in human lives. But we should also talk about the complexity, the gray areas, the moments where men on both sides made decisions they would have made differently in calmer times. The violence that went beyond what the rules of war permitted, the reprisals that were not officially acknowledged or prosecuted. Because history is not just about the grand narratives. It's also about the individual stories, the stories of the men who were there, the stories of what they experienced and how that experience changed them. And the story of the MG42 gunners on D-Day is one of those stories, a story of courage and terror and violence and, eventually, reconciliation, a story that deserves to be told in full, without sanitization, without minimization, but also without judgment, because at the end of that story, we find men who had fought each other, who had tried to kill each other, who had succeeded in killing many of each other's comrades, sitting down decades later and finding a way to talk about it, to understand each other, to establish a human connection across the gulf of warfare and time. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of D-Day. Not just that the Allies won the battle and began the liberation of Europe, but that even after terrible violence, even after acts that violated the rules of war, even after all that, human beings can still find a way to reconcile, to understand, to connect. That is the story of the MG42 gunners on D-Day. And it's a story worth telling in full, in all its complexity and darkness and, ultimately, its humanity. To truly understand what happened to the MG42 gunners on D-Day, we need to understand the larger context in which those events occurred. The battle for Normandy was part of a larger war strategy. It was one of the most significant military operations in human history, and it involved decisions at every level, from the strategic decisions made by the Allied leadership down to the individual decisions made by soldiers in the moment of combat. At the strategic level, the Allies had decided that the best way to end the war in Europe was to establish a beachhead in France and then push inland toward Germany. This would require an amphibious assault, which would be expensive in terms of casualties. The military planners knew that and accepted it. They believed that the strategic benefit of liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation was worth the cost. At the operational level, military commanders had decided that Omaha Beach would be one of the landing zones. They understood it would be difficult. They understood it would be heavily defended. But they believed it could be taken with adequate forces and careful planning. At the tactical level, military units were given specific missions. Some units were to assault the beach. Some units were to provide supporting fire. Some units were to clear obstacles. Some units were to destroy fortifications. And all of them had to work together in a coordinated effort to secure the beachhead. At the individual level, soldiers received orders and had to decide how to execute them, how to move forward under fire, whether to charge a bunker or find another route, whether to accept a surrender or continue fighting. These were individual decisions made in the moment by men who were tired, scared, traumatized, and often not fully informed about the larger situation. The MG42 gunners fit into this structure at the tactical and individual levels. They had been assigned to positions. They had been given orders to defend those positions. They carried out those orders. And when their positions were being overrun, they had to make individual decisions about what to do next. Some of those decisions resulted in the gunners being killed. Some resulted in them surrendering. Some, in cases we know about from survivor accounts, resulted in them being killed after surrendering. All of these outcomes were possible on D-Day. All of them occurred, and all of them are part of the historical record, even if some are less officially documented than others. The final piece of understanding what happened to the MG42 gunners is understanding what happened after the war. For those who survived, the war ended in 1945 with Germany's surrender. They went from being active combatants to prisoners of war to, eventually, civilians again. Some of them had been wounded and spent time in hospitals. Some of them had been in prison camps and spent years in captivity before being released. Some of them came home relatively quickly and had to rebuild their lives in a defeated, occupied Germany. For all of them, the transition from soldier to civilian was difficult. They had lost. Their country had been defeated. Their military had been destroyed. Many of them had lost friends or comrades. Many of them had witnessed horrible things or done things that they struggled to reconcile with their conscience. The immediate post-war period in Germany was chaotic. The country was divided into occupation zones. People were trying to find food and shelter. Families were being reunited, or in many cases, learning that loved ones had died in the war. The process of coming to terms with what had happened, of processing the trauma of the war, took decades. Many German survivors spoke very little about their experiences during the first years after the war. They were focused on survival, on rebuilding, on trying to move forward. But as more time passed and as their material situation improved, more of them felt comfortable reflecting on what they had experienced. Some of them published memoirs. Some of them gave interviews to historians. Some of them, like Severloh, eventually reached out to the men they had fought against and attempted to establish some kind of understanding or reconciliation. This process of reconciliation is important. It's a reminder that even after terrible violence, even after warfare that killed millions, even after atrocities and violations of the rules of war, there remains a possibility for human connection. The machine gunners of D-Day were not unique in experiencing this. Many soldiers on both sides experienced something similar. They fought, they survived, they came home, and decades later they reflected on what had happened and sometimes attempted to reconcile with former enemies. But the machine gunners had a specific role. They had caused tremendous casualties. They were hated by the men who had attacked them. They faced potential execution after surrendering. And yet some of them survived all of that and lived long enough to attempt reconciliation. That story, The story of survival, trauma, processing, and eventual reconciliation. That story is just as important as the military history, maybe more important, because it's about what warfare does to the human being, not just the tactical or strategic consequences, but the human consequences. The MG42 gunners of D-Day represent one small piece of a much larger story about warfare and its consequences. They represent the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, both heroic and terrible. They represent the trauma that stays with survivors for decades. They represent the slow process of reconciliation that can happen even after great violence. And they remind us that history is not just about grand narratives and strategic decisions. It's also about individual people, individual decisions, individual experiences, and individual attempts to come to terms with what has happened. The story of the machine gunners of D-Day, the full story including the parts that are uncomfortable or difficult to discuss, that is a story worth remembering, being accepted as prisoners. From the perspective of the machine gunners, this uncertainty must have been terrifying. You're in a position. You realize it's lost. You decide to surrender. You put down your weapons. You raise your hands. And in that moment, you don't know if you're going to live or die. The men who are capturing you have just spent hours under your machine gun fire. They've watched friends die to your fire. What are they going to do? Some would be merciful. Some would follow the rules of war and accept the surrender and treat the prisoner humanely. But some, in that moment, would decide that the casualties you had caused made you worthy of death, that reprisal was justified, that the rules of war didn't apply in this case, and you, as the surrendering gunner, would have no way of knowing which kind of soldier you were surrendering to. This uncertainty is a dark psychological reality of D-Day that is often not discussed in popular histories. The simple narrative is that the Americans won and the Germans lost. But the reality of the individual moments, the decisions made by individual soldiers, the violations of the rules of war that occurred, these realities complicate the narrative and make it more human and more tragic. The legacy of the machine gunners of D-Day, then, is not just their military role or the casualties they caused. It's also the complexity of their experience, the fact that they were ordinary soldiers following orders, the fact that many of them didn't survive the assault on their positions, the fact that those who did survive and were captured faced uncertain fates, the fact that some of them were killed after surrendering, and the fact that those who did survive and eventually came home had to live with the psychological weight of what they had experienced for the rest of their lives. That legacy is important to remember, not because the machine gunners were blameless, or because their casualties to Allied forces were justified in a moral sense, but because their experience is part of the full historical record of D-Day, and understanding the full record, in all its complexity, is important to understanding history. The story of D-Day is often told as a story of heroic courage in a just cause, and those elements are true, but it's also a story of violence on a massive scale. It's a story of violations of the rules of war. It's a story of young men on both sides dealing with fear and trauma and making impossible choices. The machine gunners of D-Day, from one perspective, represent the capacity of ordinary people to do terrible things, to cause deaths on a massive scale, to participate in warfare that killed hundreds or thousands of men. From another perspective, they represent the human capacity to survive trauma, to carry psychological wounds for decades, and eventually to seek reconciliation with those on the other side. And from a third perspective, they represent the victims of warfare itself, not because they were innocent, but because warfare, by its nature, damages everyone it touches. The gunners who survived D-Day were damaged by it. The assault team members who attacked the bunkers were damaged by it. The men who were killed were obviously damaged by it, though they didn't have decades to process what had happened. Warfare damages everything it touches. The machine gunners of D-Day understood this eventually, if not at the time, and that understanding is part of their legacy. Men who made the decision to surrender and were killed despite that decision. This is the untold story of D-Day. The story of what happened in the moments after the bunkers were overrun. The story of men who were trying to apply the rules of war in situations where the rules of war were breaking down. The machine gunners of D-Day became the focus of decades of historical investigation and reconsideration. Books were written, veterans were interviewed, memoirs were published, and what emerged was a more complete picture of what actually happened on those beaches. The popular image of D-Day often focuses on the grand scale. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. The largest amphibious operation in human history, and all of that is true. But the reality of D-Day was also fought out in small bunkers and trenches. It was fought by individuals making individual decisions. It was fought in moments of extreme violence followed by moments of extreme vulnerability. For the machine gunners, the grand scale of the operation meant nothing. What mattered was whether they could keep firing, whether their ammunition would last, whether the assault teams would reach their position before they could destroy them, whether, when the moment came to surrender, they would live or die. The MG42 was the symbol of German military capability, but it was also, by the nature of its role and its effectiveness, a target. Machine gunners were priority targets. They were hunted. They were feared, and when they were captured, they faced unique dangers because of the men they had killed. This reality added another layer of psychological pressure to the experience of being a machine gunner on D-Day. You knew you were hated. You knew you were responsible for casualties that would make you an object of vengeance to the men attacking your position. You knew that your skill with the weapon, the skill that made you valuable to the German army, would also make you a target for reprisal if captured. Some machine gunners chose to fight to the death rather than risk capture and reprisal. Others chose to surrender and hope for the best. And some were killed by men who saw the death they had caused and decided that conventional rules of warfare didn't apply. The aftermath for the survivors was complex. Those who were taken prisoner and processed through the normal prisoner of war system often spent years in captivity. American and British camps, then German camps after the war ended. They eventually returned home to a devastated Germany that was occupied by foreign armies. For many of them, the return home was not a triumphant homecoming. They had been captured. They had not fought to the death. In German military culture, where honor and commitment to the cause were valued, being captured could be seen as a failure, even if it wasn't technically your fault. So many German soldiers who were captured on D-Day chose not to talk about their experiences. Not to their families, not to their communities, not to anyone. They carried the memories in silence for decades. But eventually, as the decades passed and the war became history rather than immediate experience, some of the survivors felt more comfortable speaking about what they had experienced. They published memoirs. They gave interviews. They tried to put into words what it had been like to be there on that terrible morning, and what they described was a reality far more complex than the simple narrative of heroic defenders being overwhelmed by superior numbers. It was a reality that included moments of camaraderie, moments of terror, moments of doubt about whether their sacrifice was worth it, moments of realization that they couldn't win, moments of desperate decisions about whether to fight to the death or surrender and hope. Heinrich Severloh, in his memoir and interviews, tried to be honest about his experience. He didn't glorify it. He didn't claim that everything he did was justified or necessary. He acknowledged the casualties he had caused. He acknowledged the horror of that morning. And he expressed genuine remorse for the men he had killed, but he also explained the context. He was a soldier following orders. He was defending a position. The casualties he caused were the result of him doing his job as a soldier, not because of any personal hatred or desire to kill. This distinction might seem subtle, but it's important to understanding the moral complexity of events like D-Day. The machine gunners weren't monsters. They were soldiers. They were young men, many of them, who had been conscripted or who had volunteered into a military that had put them in positions of responsibility. And in their positions, they caused tremendous casualties. The fact that they were soldiers doesn't absolve them of responsibility for the casualties they caused. But it does provide context. It explains how it was possible for ordinary young men to cause such death and destruction without necessarily being driven by hatred or malice. This is an important lesson. The most terrible acts of violence in history are often committed by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, not by monsters or fanatics, though those exist, but by ordinary people who have been put in situations where violence is not just possible, but expected. The machine gunners of D-Day were ordinary people. They were soldiers. They did what soldiers do. They fired their weapons. They caused casualties. And then, for many of them, they had to live with the consequences of what they had done for the rest of their lives. That living with the consequences is often the hardest part. The moment of violence, when it's happening, is often simpler than the aftermath. In the moment, you're focused on survival, on completing your mission, on immediate tactical concerns. It's only later, when you have time to reflect, that the full weight of what you've done becomes clear. Severlow carried that weight for decades before he felt comfortable discussing it openly. Other survivors carried it in silence. Some never spoke about D-Day at all, taking their experiences to their graves. But the effort by men like Severlow to eventually tell their stories, to try to reconcile with former enemies, to establish human connection across the gulf of warfare, that effort is important. It's a reminder that even after terrible violence, there is a possibility for understanding and partial reconciliation. It's also a reminder of the human cost of warfare, not just the obvious costs, the dead and wounded, but the psychological cost, the trauma that stays with you for decades, the nightmares that don't go away, the guilt that doesn't fade. D-Day was a necessary operation. It was fought for a just cause. But it was also terrible. It involved killing on a massive scale. It involved moments of violation of the rules of war. It involved ordinary people committing extraordinary acts of violence, and it left scars on the men who fought it, on the families of the men who died, on the nations involved, on history itself. The machine gunners of D-Day carry part of that scar. They were central to the battle. The MG42 was the weapon that defined Omaha Beach. The casualties caused by machine gun fire were the highest single cause of casualties on that beach. And the machine gunners themselves, the young men who pulled the triggers on those weapons, had to live with the consequences. Some of them didn't live through the battle itself. Some of them were killed in their bunkers when the assault teams finally got through. Some of them, like Severlow, survived the battle but were captured and had to spend years in captivity. For those who survived, the post-war world offered a complex mixture of consequences. They had lost the war. Their country was defeated and occupied. Many of them had lost friends or comrades on D-Day. Many of them had been wounded or traumatized by their experiences, but they also survived. They came home. They rebuilt their lives. They had families. They contributed to their communities. In many ways, their lives after the war were remarkable testaments to human resilience and the desire to move forward after terrible experiences. But the memories of D-Day never left them. Even decades later, even when asked about their experiences for historical purposes, the emotion and pain of that morning came through. These were men who had carried the weight of D-Day with them for their entire lives. The story of what happened to the MG42 gunners on D-Day is a story about violence, yes, but it's also a story about humanity. It's a story about the complexity of war. It's a story about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And ultimately, it's a story about the possibility of reconciliation even after terrible violence. That possibility, the fact that men who had fought each other could eventually sit down and talk about their experiences. That fact suggests something important about human nature. That no matter how terrible the violence, no matter how deep the divide, there remains a possibility for understanding and connection. That is perhaps the most important lesson of the MG42 gunners on D-Day. Not just the military history, not just the technology or tactics, but the ultimate humanity of even those involved in warfare. The ability to cause tremendous violence and then, decades later, to seek reconciliation. For Severlow, that reconciliation came in the form of meeting David Silva. For others, It came through writing memoirs or giving interviews. For some, it never came. They carried their experiences to their graves without ever reconciling with those on the other side. But the fact that reconciliation was possible at all, that it happened in multiple cases, that surviving gunners and surviving assault team members could eventually talk to each other with empathy and understanding, that is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the aftermath of terrible warfare. The MG42 gunners of D-Day are now all gone. Several died in 2006. Others died in the decades following. The last survivors of D-Day from both sides are now very elderly. In a few decades, they will all be gone, and D-Day will be history witnessed only through documentation and the accounts that survivors left behind. But the story of what happened to those gunners, the complexity of their experience, the moral and psychological weight of what they had done, that story deserves to be remembered. Not to excuse the violence, but to understand it, to recognize the humanity of even those involved in terrible violence, to remember that war affects everyone involved, not just the victims but also those who inflict the violence, and to hold on to the possibility that even after terrible warfare, even after violations of the rules of war, even after all that, human beings can still find a way to reconcile, to understand each other, to establish connection. That is the final legacy of the MG42 gunners on D-Day.